In classified records and sealed reports, certain government programs reached a point where continuation was no longer possible. What began as structured attempts to study human response under controlled conditions produced outcomes that no longer aligned with the intentions behind them, leaving behind records marked more by hesitation than success. In the margins of these files, the decision to stop was not immediate but gradual, shaped by what the data revealed and what it refused to explain. The following accounts place you within isolated facilities and restricted sites where conditions were carefully controlled to observe human behaviour under pressure. These are environments where time, perception and sensory input were deliberately limited, and where researchers documented responses that shifted in ways they could not fully account for. Each record begins with clear objectives, but moves toward uncertainty until continuing becomes a decision that cannot be sustained. The experiment that turned on its creators, Stanford Prison, 1971. In the late summer of 1971, within the quiet academic grounds of Stanford University, a government-funded study designed to examine the psychology of imprisonment was brought to an abrupt end after those overseeing it began to question whether it should continue at all. What had been proposed as a controlled simulation, carefully structured and limited to 2 weeks, unravelled in less than a week, leaving behind a record that felt less like an experiment and more like something that had slipped beyond its original design. The official objective had been clear, even clinical, yet the outcome would blur the boundary between observation and participation in ways that were difficult to reconcile. The study, later known as the Stanford Prison Experiment, was led by psychologist Philip Zimbardo, who sought to explore how ordinary individuals might respond to the roles of prisoner and guard within a simulated prison environment. Funded in part by the US Office of Naval Research, the project aimed to provide insight into the dynamics of authority, compliance, and institutional power. Volunteers were recruited through newspaper advertisements, screened for psychological stability, and assigned roles at random, ensuring that no participant entered the study with a predisposition toward dominance or submission. Yet, from the outset, the structure contained an unusual detail that would later complicate its outcome, as Zimbardo did not remain solely a researcher, but assumed the role of prison superintendent, placing himself inside the system he intended to observe. Beneath the university's psychology building, a series of corridors and rooms were transformed into a makeshift detention facility. Doors were replaced with steel bars, windows were removed or covered, and narrow cells were constructed to confine those assigned as prisoners. The environment was deliberately stripped of comfort and familiarity, reducing it to a controlled space where behaviour could be observed without external influence. Each detail, from the uniforms to the schedules, had been designed to reinforce the illusion of incarceration while maintaining the framework of a scientific study. Participants assigned to the role of prisoners were subjected to an unexpected beginning. Without warning, they were arrested at their homes by local police, handcuffed, searched, and transported to the simulated facility, where they were processed, assigned identification numbers, and stripped of their names. The procedure, intended to create realism, introduced a level of immersion that was not entirely anticipated by the researchers themselves. It marked the first moment when the boundaries of the experiment began to shift, as participants reacted not as volunteers but as individuals experiencing a form of detainment, their identities already beginning to narrow into assigned roles. The guards, meanwhile, were given uniforms, mirrored sunglasses, and wooden batons, along with minimal instructions. They were told to maintain order but were not provided with explicit rules governing their behaviour. This absence of structure was deliberate, intended to allow natural patterns of authority to emerge, yet it also created a space where interpretation replaced limitation. Within a matter of hours, subtle changes in demeanour began to appear, as posture, tone, and interaction adjusted to fit the assigned roles, though not all guards responded in the same way, with some remaining restrained while others began to test the extent of their authority. By the second day, the atmosphere inside the simulated prison had begun to change in ways that were difficult to measure. Prisoners initiated a rebellion, refusing to follow instructions and barricading themselves within their cells. The guards responded not with scripted procedures but with improvised tactics, using fire extinguishers to force compliance and isolating those they identified as leaders. What had been conceived as a controlled observation of behaviour began to resemble an evolving system of control, shaped more by reaction than design, where each response introduced new conditions that had not been anticipated. As the days progressed, the interactions between guards and prisoners grew increasingly intense. Sleep was disrupted, privileges were granted and withdrawn without consistency, and psychological pressure replaced physical force as the primary method of control. Some guards adopted stricter routines, while others escalated their behaviour further, introducing humiliation, arbitrary punishments, and prolonged isolation, particularly during night shifts when oversight was less consistent. Prisoners were subjected to verbal harassment, repetitive tasks, and the erosion of individual identity, while guards adopted patterns of behaviour that reflected escalating authority. Observers noted that participants were no longer speaking or acting as volunteers, but as individuals fully absorbed in their assigned roles, referring to one another by numbers rather than names, as if the framework of the experiment had already replaced their original sense of identity. What made the situation more difficult to interpret was the gradual nature of the transformation. There was no single moment where the experiment visibly crossed a boundary. Instead, it shifted incrementally, with each decision building upon the last, creating an environment that felt internally consistent even as it moved further from its original purpose. Researchers, including Zimbardo himself, found themselves not only observing the system but also becoming part of it, responding to events as administrators rather than investigators, reinforcing the very structure they were meant to analyse. Several prisoners began to show signs of acute distress. Emotional breakdowns were recorded within the first 36 hours, with participants exhibiting anxiety, disorientation, and withdrawal. Some requested to leave the study, invoking what they believed to be their right as volunteers, yet their requests were met with responses that reflected the logic of the simulated environment rather than the framework of an experiment. In one documented instance, a prisoner seeking release was directed toward a form of parole process, as though his participation required negotiation rather than immediate withdrawal, a moment that revealed how deeply the roles had taken hold, not only for the participants but for those overseeing them. The language used within the facility reinforced this shift. Instructions were issued not as guidance but as orders, and compliance was expected rather than requested. Prisoners began to internalize these expectations, with some showing signs of resignation while others attempted to adapt by aligning themselves with the guards, creating divisions within the group that mirrored real institutional dynamics. The structure of the experiment had begun to sustain its own logic, independent of the original design. Outside observers were brought in to evaluate the conditions, yet their reactions varied. Some viewed the behaviour as a natural extension of the roles being played, while others expressed concern about the psychological impact on those involved. Among them was Christina Maslach, who would later describe her reaction to witnessing the interactions between guards and prisoners as a moment of recognition, where the situation no longer resembled an academic exercise, but something more troubling. Maslach's observations introduced a perspective that had not fully emerged within the core research team. She questioned the conditions under which the experiment was being conducted, focusing not only on the participants but on the behaviour of those overseeing the study. Her concerns highlighted a shift that had already begun to take place, where the roles assigned within the experiment were influencing not just the subjects, but the researchers themselves, suggesting that the system being observed had already begun to reshape those responsible for maintaining it. By the 6th day, the accumulated weight of these observations led to a decision that contrasted sharply with the original plan. The experiment, intended to last 14 days, was terminated early. The official reasoning acknowledged the psychological harm being experienced by participants, yet the abruptness of the conclusion suggested a deeper uncertainty about what the experiment had become. It was not simply that the results were unexpected, but that the conditions required to continue observing them were no longer justifiable, particularly as the distinction between voluntary participation and imposed reality had grown increasingly unclear. In the years that followed, the Stanford prison experiment would be analysed, criticised, and debated within the field of psychology. Questions were raised about methodology, ethics, and the influence of suggestion, yet the core events remained documented and widely recognised. The study revealed how quickly individuals could adapt to roles within a structured environment, but it also exposed the difficulty of maintaining objectivity once those roles began to take hold, especially when the observer was no longer separate from the system being observed. The involvement of a government research agency added another layer to its interpretation. The funding provided by the Office of Naval Research reflected an interest in understanding the dynamics of authority within institutional settings, particularly in contexts relevant to military and correctional systems. What the experiment ultimately demonstrated, however, was not simply how authority could be exercised, but how easily it could evolve beyond its intended limits, shaping behaviour in ways that were neither predicted nor easily reversed. The records of the experiment, including video footage and transcripts, preserve moments that feel suspended between observation and participation. Guards pacing corridors with measured authority, prisoners responding with hesitation or resistance, and researchers moving through the environment as both supervisors and contributors to its structure. Each element reflects a system that operated according to its own internal logic, one that became increasingly difficult to step outside of once it was in motion. Over time, the experiment has been reframed not only as a study of behaviour, but as a cautionary example of how controlled environments can reshape perception. The transformation did not occur in isolation, but through interaction, reinforcement, and the gradual acceptance of roles that began as temporary assignments. What remained unclear, even after the study ended, was the precise point at which the experiment ceased to be a simulation and became something else entirely. The participants returned to their lives, the simulated prison was dismantled, and the physical space reverted to its original state. Yet the implications of what had taken place continued to be examined, not only in academic discussions, but in broader considerations of authority, responsibility, and the limits of experimental design. The study had been stopped, but the questions it raised extended far beyond its duration. Because somewhere within those 6 days, without a clear moment of transition, the experiment no longer required enforcement to continue, it had already begun sustaining itself. When obedience became uncontrollable, Milgram's breaking point, 1961-1963. What began inside a quiet laboratory at Yale University as a government-supported study into obedience would later be halted when those overseeing it could no longer ignore what the results were revealing. Conducted in the early 1960s, the experiment was shaped by a question that had not yet settled in the years following the World War II, where acts carried out under orders had forced a broader examination of authority and responsibility. The design appeared simple, contained, and measurable, yet the outcomes would begin to suggest something less predictable, something that did not behave as expected when placed under observation. At first glance, the procedure appeared structured, controlled, and carefully limited, as though every possible outcome had already been anticipated by Stanley Milgram. Participants were told they were taking part in a study of memory and learning, assigned the role of teacher, and introduced to another individual who would serve as the learner, though this second participant was in fact a Confederate. The setting was deliberate in its neutrality, a laboratory space with minimal distraction, where the apparatus itself became the focal point, a shock generator marked with incremental voltage levels that suggested increasing intensity without requiring explanation. The moment the first hesitation occurs, it is brief enough to seem insignificant, almost expected within the confines of an unfamiliar task. The teacher reads a list of word pairs, administers a test, and is instructed to deliver an electric shock each time the learner responds incorrectly. At lower levels, the action feels procedural, detached from consequence, reinforced by the calm presence of the experimenter who stands nearby, offering guidance in measured tones. There is no immediate indication that anything within the process requires interruption. Each increase in voltage introduces a new threshold, one that appears designed to provoke refusal but instead produces something far less predictable. The labels on the generator shift gradually from mild to moderate, then to strong, each step accompanied by a moment in which the participant pauses, glances toward the experimenter, and waits. These pauses form a pattern, brief interruptions that suggest uncertainty but do not resolve into defiance, as though the structure itself absorbs hesitation and redirects it into continuation. When the voice from the adjacent room begins to protest, the situation shifts from abstract instruction to something that feels unmistakably real. The learner, now separated by a wall, expresses discomfort, then distress, then refusal, insisting that the shocks be stopped. The reactions are audible, specific, and difficult to ignore, introducing a human presence that challenges the neutrality of the task. Yet the experiment does not pause, and the participant is reminded that the procedure requires continuation. Even as discomfort becomes visible, the response that follows does not interrupt the process but quietly allows it to continue. Participants turn to the experimenter, questioning whether they should proceed, and are met with standardized prompts delivered without variation. The phrases remain consistent, neutral, and authoritative, offering reassurance without explanation, reinforcing the idea that the responsibility does not lie with the individual administering the shocks but with the structure of the experiment itself. What repeats from this point forward is not escalation in the usual sense, but a pattern in which expectation and outcome begin to separate. Each increase in voltage seems to approach a limit where refusal should occur, yet the limit continues to move, not because the scale changes, but because the participant adapts to it. The thresholds lose their finality, becoming steps in a sequence that continues beyond what initially appeared acceptable. At higher levels, the reactions on the other side grow more urgent, yet the structure of the experiment remains unchanged. The learner's protests intensify, referencing pain and concern for personal safety, introducing a level of specificity that removes any remaining abstraction. The participant hears these responses clearly, reacts to them visibly, and still awaits instruction before deciding whether to proceed. Once the responses stop altogether, the absence of sound introduces a different kind of tension, one that leaves the participant without confirmation. The silence suggests something unresolved, yet the instructions do not shift to account for it. The participant is told to treat the lack of response as an incorrect answer, to continue administering shocks as though the process remains intact, even when the feedback that once guided it has disappeared. In that silence, the decision to continue no longer relies on feedback, but on something less visible and more difficult to define. The participant remains in position, repeating the procedure, pressing switches that now produce no audible reaction, guided only by the presence of the experimenter and the expectation that the task has not yet concluded. The absence of resistance from the learner does not reduce the tension, but alters it, shifting it inward. The instructions given by the experimenter remain calm, measured, and unchanged, even as the situation begins to feel increasingly unstable. There is no visible adjustment in tone, no acknowledgement that the conditions have shifted, only the continued delivery of prompts that emphasize the necessity of completion. The consistency of these responses creates a contrast with the growing uncertainty experienced by the participant, reinforcing the authority of the structure over individual judgment. What becomes difficult to ignore is not the behavior of the participants, but how consistently that behavior aligns with the authority placed in front of them. In the baseline condition of the experiment, a significant majority of participants continued administering shocks up to the highest level marked on the generator, 450 volts, despite visible signs of stress and repeated expressions of concern. The outcome does not reflect a small number of extreme cases, but a pattern that emerges across multiple sessions. As the sessions continue, the results begin to form a pattern that was neither fully expected nor easily explained. Participants exhibit signs of tension, including sweating, trembling, and nervous laughter, yet these reactions do not translate into refusal. Instead, they coexist with continued compliance, creating a contradiction between internal response and external action that remains unresolved within the framework of the experiment. It is at this point that the focus begins to shift, not toward those following instructions, but toward those who designed them. The structure that had been intended to measure obedience begins to reveal something more complex, suggesting that the conditions themselves may be influencing behavior in ways that extend beyond the original hypothesis. The role of the experimenter, once defined as neutral, becomes part of the mechanism driving the outcome. The question that emerges is no longer how far individuals will go, but why there was so little resistance along the way. The experiment does not produce isolated moments of compliance, but a consistent pattern that challenges assumptions about personal agency and moral decision-making. The findings introduce a level of discomfort that extends beyond the participants, raising concerns among those observing the results about what has been uncovered. As awareness of the outcome spreads, ethical concerns begin to surface with increasing urgency. Critics question the psychological impact on participants, the level of deception involved, and the implications of the findings themselves. While the experiment does not end abruptly in the same manner as others, the continuation of such procedures becomes increasingly difficult to justify, as the results suggest not only what people are capable of doing, but how easily those actions can be guided. What remains documented is not simply a set of results, but a series of moments in which the expected interruption never occurs. Each hesitation, each glance toward the experimenter, each opportunity to stop forms part of a sequence that continues without resolution. The structure holds, the procedure advances, and the anticipated breaking point is deferred again and again. The moment that should have stopped everything did not arrive as a single decision, but as something repeatedly recognized and quietly ignored. The mind that would not return, MK Ultra's unstable subjects, 1950s, 1970s. Within archived intelligence summaries and scattered declassified files, references to behavioral research programs appear in forms that resist continuity, as though the documentation itself was never intended to be read as a whole. The surviving materials connected to early Cold War research efforts reveal not a single unified project, but a network of sub-projects operating under shifting priorities within the Central Intelligence Agency. In the absence of complete records, what remains is a structure that can be partially traced, though never fully reconstructed, with each fragment offering only a limited view of processes that were once considered routine. Across several partial records attributed to early Cold War research priorities, the terminology shifts without warning, leaving gaps where experimental intent should have been clearly defined. References to behavioral studies appear alongside vague notations about chemical exposure, yet the purpose behind these combinations is rarely documented in a way that explains their intended outcome. In some cases, the language suggests an attempt to explore the limits of human perception, though the exact parameters of those explorations are never consistently outlined. The result is a body of material that gestures toward intention without ever fully confirming it. In accounts linked to institutional oversight, procedures are described with clinical precision, yet the surrounding context dissolves, offering no consistent explanation for how those procedures were applied in practice. The records often separate method from consequence, listing actions without detailing the environment in which they occurred or the conditions under which they were carried out. This separation creates a disconnect that makes it difficult to determine whether the procedures were isolated experiments or part of a broader interconnected framework. During the early phases of what would later be associated with the broader Central Intelligence Agency research initiatives, certain experiments were conducted in controlled environments, where the stated objectives were not always recorded alongside the methods. These environments varied in form, including institutional settings, hospital facilities, and research spaces that were adapted for observation. The lack of consistent documentation regarding purpose and outcome leaves behind a procedural outline without a clearly defined endpoint, as though the experiments were designed to continue without requiring a conclusion. Through fragments of testimony and recovered documentation, patterns begin to emerge in which subjects exposed to chemical compounds such as LSD were observed under conditions that prioritized observation over explanation. These accounts describe alterations in perception, shifts in awareness, and disruptions in the ability to maintain consistent thought patterns, though the language used to record these changes varies widely. Some reports rely on clinical terminology, while others adopt more descriptive phrasing, yet neither approach fully captures the experience being recorded. Elsewhere in the surviving materials, descriptions of hypnotic techniques and sensory manipulation appear without consistent procedural framing, creating accounts that seem to begin after key decisions were already made. The absence of a clear starting point makes it difficult to determine whether these techniques were applied as part of a structured methodology or explored as independent variables. In either case, the records do not provide sufficient continuity to trace the progression of each method from initiation to outcome. From within these partial narratives, references to memory disruption appear with unusual frequency, though each instance is recorded in a way that leaves its origin uncertain and its interpretation incomplete. Subjects are described as experiencing gaps in recollection, difficulty distinguishing between events, and inconsistencies in their ability to recall prior states. These observations are often recorded without follow-up, leaving open questions about duration, intensity, and long-term effects. At certain points in the documentation, subjects are described as responding to instructions that are no longer clearly linked to any identifiable source within the record. This creates a scenario in which actions are noted without context, as though the connection between instruction and response has been severed. The resulting entries describe behaviour in isolation, offering no indication of how the instructions were delivered or how they were perceived by the individuals involved. In medical-style reports, behavioural changes are noted with precision, yet the absence of baseline comparisons prevents any definitive understanding of what those changes represent. Without consistent pre-exposure data, the recorded shifts in cognition, emotion, or perception cannot be measured against a known starting point. This limitation introduces uncertainty into every observation, as each change exists without a clearly defined reference. Within institutional summaries prepared during the height of the program, language is often reduced to brief statements that acknowledge results without detailing the processes that produced them. These summaries suggest outcomes but omit the conditions that led to those outcomes, creating a record that acknowledges change without explaining its cause. The absence of explanatory detail reinforces the fragmented nature of the documentation, leaving only partial insights into the scope of the work. As additional fragments are examined, inconsistencies appear not only between accounts but within individual records, where descriptions shift tone and detail without clear cause. A single document may present multiple interpretations of the same observation, each differing in emphasis or conclusion. These internal contradictions make it difficult to establish a stable understanding of what was observed, as if the records themselves were subject to the same instability described within them. In some recovered notes, references to identity and perception are presented in ways that suggest instability, though the terminology used to describe these conditions varies from one document to another. Some accounts describe subjects as experiencing confusion about their own identity, while others refer to disruptions in cognitive continuity without further elaboration. The variability in language suggests that these phenomena were observed but not fully understood within the framework of the research. During the later stages of the program, internal concerns begin to surface in administrative correspondence, hinting at uncertainty regarding both outcomes and oversight. These concerns are not always explicit, but they appear in the form of cautious language, revised procedures, and increasing attention to control measures. The shift in tone suggests a growing awareness that the results of the research may not align with its original intent. Following increased scrutiny and investigative efforts within the United States, the program was formally discontinued in 1973, after which many associated records were sealed, destroyed, or heavily redacted. The termination marked the end of an active research initiative, though it did not resolve the questions raised by its existence. The removal of documentation created additional gaps, ensuring that portions of the program would remain permanently inaccessible. Even after official termination, subsequent investigations revealed that the scope of the program had extended across multiple locations and research approaches, many of which remain only partially documented. These findings suggest that the work conducted under the program was not confined to a single method or setting, but instead operated across a network of efforts that were not always fully recorded. In reviewing the remaining evidence, researchers encountered accounts that could not be fully verified, yet could not be dismissed without acknowledging the patterns they suggested. The tension between what can be confirmed and what remains uncertain becomes a defining feature of the historical record, shaping the way the program is understood in the absence of complete information. Across all surviving material, the absence of a single coherent narrative becomes its most defining feature, as though the structure of the records themselves reflects the instability of the work they describe. The fragments persist without resolving into a complete account, leaving the boundaries of the program indistinct and its full implications unresolved. Somewhere between what was recorded and what was erased, the full extent of the program still refuses to settle into a version that can be completely known. The Study That Continued Too Long, Tuskegee's Internal Silence, 1932-1972. In the rural setting of Macon County, Alabama, a long-term medical study began in 1932, framed at its outset as an effort to observe the progression of a disease within a specific population over time. The conditions under which it is introduced appear routine for the period, shaped by the medical assumptions and limitations that defined early 20th century public health practice. At its core, the study is described in terms of observation, with its structure built around tracking the natural course of illness rather than altering it, a distinction that, at the time, aligns with established research approaches. At the time of its initiation, the structure of the study is defined by observation rather than intervention, with participants monitored under conditions that reflect the medical understanding of the early 20th century. The language used in early documentation emphasizes continuity and measurement, with repeated references to tracking progression over extended periods. This framing presents the study as methodical and controlled, with its purpose situated within a broader effort to document disease behavior across time. During the early decades of the program, records describe a consistent approach that emphasizes documentation, tracking the course of illness without indicating significant changes to its underlying design. As years pass, the structure remains stable, with reports maintaining a similar tone and format, reinforcing the sense that the study is not evolving but continuing in its original form. The absence of deviation becomes a defining characteristic, not through dramatic action, but through sustained repetition. By the 1940s, the introduction of effective treatment for syphilis through penicillin marked a turning point in medical practice, yet the structure of the study continues without incorporating these developments. This moment represents a clear divergence between general medical advancement and the trajectory of the study itself, as the availability of treatment does not translate into a corresponding change in approach. The records remain consistent, documenting progression without reflecting the broader shift in medical capability. Within the framework of the United States Public Health Service, documentation reflects ongoing oversight, with records indicating continuity maintained through established procedures. The study is situated within a system of institutional reporting, where its continuation is recorded across multiple levels of administration. Each layer contributes to a structure that maintains the study without requiring constant re-evaluation, allowing it to persist through formal channels of approval. As years pass, the repetition of similar observations across multiple reports begins to define the study more clearly than any single recorded outcome. The accumulation of documentation creates a pattern in which the absence of change becomes more visible than any individual entry. This consistency, recorded over decades, forms a continuous thread that ties the study together, even as external conditions continue to evolve. Rather than a single point of authority, the study operates through a network of institutional roles, each contributing to a system in which responsibility is distributed across multiple levels. This structure diffuses accountability, making it difficult to isolate any one decision as the determining factor in the study's continuation. The result is a system that sustains itself through alignment rather than direction, where continuation is maintained through the absence of interruption. In parallel with the study's continuation, medical ethics begin to evolve, introducing new expectations around consent and treatment that are not consistently reflected within the study's framework. Over time, broader professional standards shift toward greater emphasis on informed participation, yet these developments do not immediately alter the recorded practices of the study. The contrast between emerging ethical standards and ongoing procedures becomes increasingly difficult to reconcile within the documentation. Despite these broader changes in medical standards, the documentation shows little deviation from the study's original structure, suggesting a form of institutional inertia that resists adjustment. The study continues to operate within its established framework, with reports maintaining the same general format and focus. This lack of change is not presented as a decision, but as a condition, one that persists without requiring justification in the records themselves. Across successive reports, the absence of interruption becomes increasingly significant, as the study's duration itself emerges as its most defining characteristic. What is recorded is not a series of turning points, but a continuous line of observation, extending over decades without clear breaks. The length of time becomes part of the record, shaping the way the study is understood, not through its outcomes, but through its persistence. When public attention eventually brings the study to light in 1972, the resulting exposure forces an immediate end to its continuation under scrutiny. The disclosure reveals the study's existence to a broader audience, prompting a reassessment that leads to its termination. The moment of exposure does not alter what has already occurred, but it marks the point at which the study can no longer proceed without consequence. In the aftermath of its termination, analysis of the study reveals that its persistence was shaped not by a single decision, but by a system in which the act of stopping required more effort than continuing. The structure that allowed the study to persist is examined in detail, with attention given to the ways in which oversight, responsibility, and institutional processes interacted over time. What emerges is not a single explanation, but a network of factors that together enabled its continuation. The most difficult question left behind is not what the study measured, but what made it possible for it to remain in motion for so long without interruption. Induced fear in children, the monster study's lasting damage, 1939. In early 1939, within a clinical setting at the University of Iowa, a small group of children became part of a study that would later be associated with lasting ethical controversy, though at the time it was presented as an inquiry into the causes of speech irregularities. The experiment, later associated with Wendell Johnson and graduate researcher Mary Tudor, would eventually be discontinued after its methods and implications came under scrutiny, but in its earliest phase, it appeared to align with the scientific curiosity surrounding speech development in children. Within carefully arranged sessions conducted under controlled observation, the researchers began separating children into categories that would shape the way their speech and their perception of themselves was interpreted. This classification was not random but intentional, dividing participants based on whether they were already identified as having speech irregularities or were considered fluent speakers, establishing a structure that allowed comparison between perceived normality and perceived deficiency. Among those selected from institutional settings, several children at the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans Home were included in the study, introducing a group already shaped by loss and instability into a structured experimental environment. Their circumstances were not incidental to the study's design, as the researchers had access to a population that could be observed over time within a controlled setting, making longitudinal observation possible without the logistical barriers that might exist elsewhere. Through repeated interactions framed as therapeutic guidance, the language used by researchers gradually shifted from supportive to critical, creating an atmosphere where speech was no longer simply evaluated but scrutinized. For some children, feedback that initially reinforced confidence was replaced with correction that emphasized errors, and over time, the distinction between instruction and evaluation began to blur, altering how the children engaged with each speaking attempt. At a time when scientific approaches to speech disorders were still developing, the distinction between encouragement and negative reinforcement became blurred, allowing fear to be introduced as an unmeasured but influential factor. The researchers aimed to explore whether anxiety could contribute to the onset of stuttering, operating under the assumption that psychological pressure might reveal latent speech tendencies, even though such pressure was not formally quantified within the study's framework. As sessions continued over time, observations recorded by Mary Tudor documented changes in some children's speech patterns, though the interpretation of these changes remained open to debate. Some children who had been told they were beginning to stutter reportedly began to hesitate more frequently, while others appeared to withdraw during speaking tasks, though the extent to which these responses were directly caused by the experimental conditions remains a matter of interpretation. Not long after the experimental period concluded, researchers began noting that some children who had not previously shown speech difficulties appeared to exhibit stuttering behaviours. These observations introduced a lingering uncertainty, as it was unclear whether the changes represented temporary reactions to the experimental environment or longer-term alterations in speech development. Following the conclusion of the study, the work associated with Wendell Johnson gradually became the subject of ethical scrutiny, though the full implications were not immediately recognised. For a period of time, the research remained within academic discussion, but as ethical frameworks evolved, questions began to emerge regarding consent, psychological risk, and the responsibilities owed to child participants. Decades later, as academic review standards evolved, the experiment was revisited with a far more critical perspective, revealing practices that would no longer be considered acceptable under modern research ethics. The absence of informed consent, the deliberate induction of fear, and the use of vulnerable children as subjects all contributed to a reassessment that reframed the study not as a neutral investigation, but as a case study in ethical violation. In the broader context of psychological research, The study came to be viewed as an example of how vulnerable populations can be affected when experimental goals override individual well-being. What was once seen as a controlled inquiry into speech pathology gradually became an example of how easily scientific intent can intersect with harm when safeguards are not fully established or enforced. Across time and analysis, the most difficult aspect to fully quantify was not the procedural design of the study, but the persistence of its effects beyond the controlled environment in which they began. The children involved were never continuously monitored across their later lives in a way that could definitively measure long-term impact, leaving the full extent of the consequences open to interpretation and incomplete records. Some effects appeared to fade with time, while others seemed to remain in ways that were never directly recorded, leaving behind questions that no archive could fully resolve. The Chemical Edge of Consciousness, Edgewood Arsenal, 1955-1975. Within controlled facilities at Edgewood Arsenal in the mid-1950s, a government-led research program began examining how psychoactive compounds affected human perception, forming part of broader military efforts associated with the United States Army before the program was eventually discontinued after researchers refused to continue its trajectory. The stated objective was precise and technical, focused on understanding how certain substances could influence cognition under controlled conditions, yet the outcomes would begin to suggest something less stable than the framework that contained them. During early phases of testing under monitored conditions, subjects, many of them enlisted personnel, were introduced to chemical agents designed to alter cognitive and sensory processing, including compounds that had been developed or repurposed within military research programs. Participation was often framed as routine testing within a structured environment, where procedures were presented with clarity, though the full range of potential effects was not always fully understood by those experiencing them. The protocols were constructed to isolate variables, with controlled dosages, observation periods, and standardized environments intended to ensure that each response could be measured against a known baseline. Across repeated administrations conducted in secure environments, substances such as BZ, 3-quinaclidinyl benzylate, were evaluated for their ability to disrupt normal mental functioning without causing immediate physical harm. Alongside such compounds, a broader range of chemical agents was explored, each designed to influence the mind in distinct ways, from sedation to disorientation to perceptual distortion. The diversity of substances introduced an expanding field of variables, where each compound produced effects that were not always comparable, yet were recorded within the same framework of observation. In documented sessions where environmental variables were carefully controlled, researchers observed that responses to the same compounds varied significantly, with no two reactions appearing entirely identical across subjects. Some individuals reported confusion and disorientation, while others exhibited delayed responses, fragmented thought patterns, or difficulty distinguishing between internal and external stimuli. Even under identical conditions, the divergence in experience suggested that the compounds were interacting not just with the body, but with the structure of perception itself. As observations accumulated over successive trials, the results began to reflect not just physiological responses, but differences in how individuals perceived time, space, and internal cognition. Reports indicated that subjects sometimes experienced distortions in duration, perceiving brief intervals as extended periods, while others described sensations that resisted clear categorization. These accounts, often dependent on self-reporting, introduced a complication, as the reliability of description became uncertain when the very faculties required to describe experience were themselves under chemical influence. In some instances, responses were recorded only after the effects had begun to diminish, leaving open the possibility that portions of the experience were never fully captured in the moment they occurred. Within the recorded data, patterns emerged that suggested instability in perception, though these patterns resisted simple classification, as subjective experiences could not always be aligned with objective measurement. The language used to describe these reactions often shifted between clinical terminology and descriptive phrasing, reflecting the difficulty of translating internal states into structured data. Observers could document behavior, but the internal experience remained partially inaccessible, existing beyond the reach of direct verification, and at times beyond the subject's own ability to recall with certainty once the session concluded. At certain points in the program, reports indicated that sensory distortions became difficult to reconcile with baseline observations, introducing uncertainty into how fully the effects of the compounds could be understood through external monitoring alone. Subjects might appear physically stable while reporting experiences that suggested significant cognitive disruption, creating a separation between observable condition and internal perception. In some cases, the conclusion of observation periods did not immediately restore subjects to a clearly defined baseline, raising questions about whether the effects had fully dissipated or simply shifted beyond measurable limits. The possibility that residual effects lingered in ways not easily detected added another layer of uncertainty to the recorded outcomes. As dosage levels and exposure durations varied between trials, the unpredictability of outcomes became more pronounced, complicating efforts to define consistent thresholds for safety or predictability. Adjustments intended to refine results instead revealed further variability, suggesting that the interaction between compound and subject was influenced by factors that could not be fully controlled within the experimental design. Attempts to standardize outcomes were met with divergence, reinforcing the sense that perception could not be uniformly altered predictably. Through the progression of the program, concerns began to emerge regarding the limits of controlled experimentation, as the boundary between intended effect and unintended consequence grew increasingly difficult to maintain. The objective of measuring cognitive alteration remained intact, yet the range of possible outcomes expanded beyond what had been initially anticipated. This expansion did not present as a sudden failure, but as a gradual recognition that the system under study, the human mind, did not respond as a fixed or fully predictable structure. Following extended evaluation of the program's outcomes, internal assessments led to growing hesitation among researchers regarding the continuation of experiments involving such compounds. The hesitation was not tied to a single incident, but to the accumulation of observations that resisted consistent interpretation. The inability to reliably predict reactions, combined with uncertainty about lingering effects, introduced a level of risk that could not be fully quantified within the existing framework of testing. In time, the accumulation of uncertainty and concern resulted in the discontinuation of the program, with the decision reflecting a point at which continuation was no longer considered acceptable under prevailing standards. The experiments ended not with a definitive conclusion, but with a recognition that the variables involved, both chemical and cognitive, could not be fully contained within the methods used to study them. In the broader review of the research conducted at Edgewood Arsenal, the focus shifted toward understanding what could be reliably measured when consciousness itself had been chemically altered. The data remained, preserved in reports and summaries, yet its interpretation required acknowledging the limitations of the conditions under which it had been gathered, particularly when the subject of study was the very mechanism through which experience is understood. Across subsequent analyses, the data revealed limitations in capturing subjective experience, leaving unresolved questions about how perception and reality interact under chemically induced conditions. The records describe what was observed, but not always what was experienced, creating a gap that persists even when the documentation appears complete, and leaving open the possibility that some effects extended beyond what could be recorded at all, or beyond what could later be reliably recalled. What remained unrecorded in those moments may never be fully reconstructed, leaving behind a record that describes the edges of perception without ever fully defining its center. Biological Exposure Without Boundaries, Operation Sea Spray, 1950. A naval test conducted in 1950 near the San Francisco coastline unfolded under conditions that extended beyond controlled laboratory environments, and although Operation Sea Spray was later discontinued after researchers refused to continue its trajectory, its early intent focused on observing how biological agents behaved once released into open air. The program emerged within a broader context of United States military research into biological warfare, where questions of dispersal, survivability, and environmental interaction were explored through controlled release. Yet the moment the material left the confines of controlled handling, the structure of the experiment began to shift in ways that could no longer be fully governed. Carried outward from offshore vessels during 1950, the dispersal of bacterial aerosols into the surrounding coastal environment introduced shifting atmospheric variables, where wind movement and distance created conditions that could not remain stable or fully predicted once the release had begun. The organisms used in the test, including Serratia marquescens and Bacillus globigii, were selected in part because they were thought to present low immediate risk while still providing measurable indicators of spread. However, the act of release transformed the coastline into an active field of observation, where the movement of air and water became inseparable from the behavior of the biological material itself. Reaching populated regions near San Francisco in 1950, the dispersed material extended beyond any clearly defined perimeter, leaving uncertainty about how widely the exposure spread and whether its full range could ever be accurately determined after the initial release. Homes, streets, and public spaces became part of an unmarked environment of exposure, where individuals were not informed of the test and had no immediate awareness of their inclusion within it. The absence of notification removed any possibility of voluntary participation, transforming the nature of the experiment into something that extended beyond traditional boundaries of consent and observation. Captured in limited sampling following the 1950 trials, traces of bacterial presence were identified in select locations, yet these measurements represented only what could be detected within constrained conditions, leaving broader regions unaccounted for and beyond verification. Detection methods at the time were limited in both range and sensitivity, meaning that the presence of biological material could only be confirmed in isolated instances where samples were collected. Between those points of measurement, large areas remained unexamined, and the continuity of exposure could not be reconstructed with certainty. Examined in the aftermath of the 1950 operation, internal discussions reflected increasing uncertainty regarding control, traceability, and unintended spread, contributing to hesitation among those responsible for the program and ultimately leading to its discontinuation. The inability to define the full scope of dispersal raised concerns not only about the outcome of the specific test, but also about the broader implications of conducting biological experiments in uncontrolled environments. The decision to halt further activity did not erase what had already occurred, nor did it restore the conditions under which the release had taken place. Preserved within official records from 1950, the documented findings represented only the portions of the operation that could be observed and recorded, while the broader extent of what occurred beyond those limits remained unresolved and only partially understood. Over time, the distance between the event and its documentation introduced additional uncertainty, as later interpretation depended on incomplete data sets and the constraints of the original observations. The records remained fixed, but the reality they attempted to describe could not be fully reconstructed from within their limits. The limits of observation never aligned with the scope of what was released. The Bodies That Measured Fallout, Project Sunshine, 1950s, 1960s. In the years following the expansion of nuclear testing, a series of investigations emerged under the direction of the United States Atomic Energy Commission, among them a program later identified as Project Sunshine, a study that would eventually become associated with quiet internal hesitation before being discontinued as researchers raised concerns about its methods. The effort was not designed around spectacle or immediate discovery, but rather around accumulation, a slow and deliberate mapping of radioactive isotopes as they moved through air, soil, and into the biological structures of human beings, where the traces of nuclear testing could persist in ways that were not immediately visible. Within this framework, the work carried an unusual characteristic from its earliest stages, as it required not only environmental samples but biological ones, extending the boundaries of observation into areas that had rarely been formalized within large-scale scientific programs. The central focus of the study revolved around isotopes such as strontium-90, a byproduct of nuclear detonations that exhibited chemical similarities to calcium, allowing it to be absorbed into bones and teeth where it could remain for extended periods. Scientists recognized that this property made it uniquely valuable for tracing the long-term effects of fallout, particularly as it entered the human body through contaminated food chains and environmental exposure. The analysis of these isotopes required access to bone samples, and it was this requirement that gradually shaped the direction of the project, as researchers sought to obtain specimens from a wide and increasingly global network. What began as an abstract question about atmospheric dispersion soon evolved into a more complex inquiry, one that required the physical remnants of human life in order to produce measurable conclusions. The collection of samples expanded across regions, reaching hospitals, coroners, and international partners who contributed to the growing repository of data. In some cases, these samples were obtained through established institutional channels, while in others, the pathways remained less clearly defined, creating an environment in which the origin of certain specimens became difficult to trace with precision. The scale of this collection effort allowed researchers to construct one of the earliest comprehensive maps of radioactive contamination within human populations, offering insights into how nuclear fallout had integrated itself into biological systems across different geographies. Yet, as the dataset expanded, so too did the complexity of its acquisition, and questions began to surface about the processes that made such a large body of material available for study. Behind the accumulation of specimens, an extensive network of cooperation developed, involving agreements between research institutions, medical facilities, and governmental bodies across multiple countries, including regions in Europe and the Pacific where nuclear testing had been conducted or observed. These arrangements often relied on pre-existing medical infrastructures, where samples could be preserved and transmitted under conditions that were routine within scientific exchange, yet the scale and intent of this particular effort distinguished it from ordinary practice. The coordination required to sustain such a network suggested an organized system that extended beyond individual laboratories, indicating a level of administrative alignment that allowed data to flow steadily back to centralized research teams. Within this structure, the samples themselves became part of a larger logistical system, moving across borders as both scientific material and quiet indicators of a global condition that was still being defined. Infants and children became a particularly significant focus within the research, as their developing skeletal structures absorbed isotopes at higher rates than adults, making their remains especially informative for measuring contamination levels. This aspect of the study underscored the depth of biological integration that researchers were attempting to measure, as it revealed how exposure could begin at the earliest stages of life and persist long after. The inclusion of such samples intensified the scientific value of the data, but it also introduced a layer of discomfort within the research community, as the implications of studying the most vulnerable populations became increasingly difficult to separate from the goals of the investigation itself. In this environment, the act of measurement carried a weight that extended beyond technical observation, entering into a domain where the source of the data became inseparable from its interpretation. As the findings began to accumulate, they revealed a pattern that confirmed what had only been partially understood before. Strontium-90 was present in the human body at measurable levels, and its distribution reflected the reach of nuclear fallout across global ecosystems. This discovery contributed to a growing awareness of how nuclear testing could influence public health on an international scale, and the data produced through the study became a reference point for subsequent policy discussions surrounding atmospheric testing. The scientific clarity of the results stood in contrast to the uncertainty surrounding the means by which the data had been gathered, creating a divide between the knowledge produced and the processes that enabled it. Within research circles, the implications of these findings began to intersect with broader discussions about environmental monitoring and the long-term consequences of radioactive exposure, particularly as evidence accumulated that contamination was not confined to isolated regions, but was instead dispersed through global systems. The results from Project Sunshine contributed to a growing body of knowledge that would later support international agreements aimed at restricting atmospheric nuclear testing, though at the time, the connection between the data and policy remained gradual and indirect. The study's influence extended beyond its immediate scope, shaping how future research would approach the relationship between environmental contamination and human biology, even as the origins of its own data continued to remain a subject of quiet scrutiny. The ethical implications of the project became more pronounced as the research progressed, particularly as awareness grew regarding how human remains were being incorporated into the study. The use of post-mortem samples introduced questions about consent and ownership, as well as the responsibilities of researchers when working with materials derived from individuals who had not explicitly agreed to such use. These concerns did not immediately halt the project, but they began to shape internal discussions, influencing how the work was perceived within scientific and governmental circles. The tension between the need for accurate data and the ethical considerations surrounding its collection created an undercurrent that persisted throughout the later stages of the study. By the time the project approached its conclusion, it had produced a detailed and unprecedented record of radioactive accumulation within the human body, offering insights that would inform future research and policy. However, the accumulation of data did not resolve the underlying concerns that had emerged during its operation. Instead, it left behind a record that could be studied indefinitely, even as the methods used to gather it continued to raise questions about the boundaries of scientific inquiry. Researchers who had once contributed to the project began to distance themselves from certain aspects of its methodology, and in some cases, their reluctance to continue reflected the growing awareness that the work had entered territory that was no longer easily justified within traditional ethical frameworks. The program did not end with a singular moment of closure, but rather with a gradual withdrawal as participation diminished and oversight increased, allowing the study to fade into a quieter phase before ultimately being discontinued. What remained was not only a body of scientific data, but also a lingering awareness that the pursuit of understanding had required choices that would be revisited long after the work itself had stopped. And somewhere within the preserved records, the question still lingers of how far observation can reach before it begins to change the very evidence it seeks to measure. The interrogation methods that went too far, Project Artichoke, 1951-1953. Control frameworks established during the early 1950s introduced a series of experimental conditions that sought to determine whether human response could be directed through structured psychological pressure, even as documentation later associated with Project Artichoke suggested that the boundaries of such influence were never fully predictable. Within intelligence circles, the program was not defined by a single method, but by an evolving series of controlled inquiries, each designed to explore how far questioning could extend before it began to alter the very responses it was attempting to extract. The work remained largely confined to classified environments, where oversight was limited, and the structure of experimentation could be adjusted as new observations emerged. Over time, the underlying framework appeared less like a fixed protocol and more like a flexible system, one that adapted continuously to its own findings without ever arriving at a stable definition of its limits. Within that adaptability, however, lay an implicit problem. Every refinement appeared to generate new uncertainty rather than reduce it, suggesting that the system was not converging toward clarity but moving deeper into complexity. Within enclosed environments designed to limit external variables, subjects were observed under sequences of questioning and suggestion intended to isolate moments where perception itself could be altered without immediate physical force. These environments were constructed to reduce predictability, allowing researchers to examine how shifts in tone, timing, and repetition could influence response patterns over extended periods. The emphasis was not on abrupt outcomes, but on gradual changes, where small deviations in behavior could reveal larger patterns in how information was retained, distorted, or withheld under controlled conditions. The controlled nature of these settings also ensured that even subtle environmental factors, lighting, sound, duration, could be adjusted with precision, creating a setting in which the subject's responses existed within a narrowing field of uncertainty. As the range of variables became more tightly managed, the margin for unexpected behavior did not disappear but instead became more noticeable, as though the reduction of external noise allowed internal variability to surface with greater clarity. Recorded observations from the period indicate that certain methods relied not on overt coercion, but on the controlled repetition of stimuli, timing, and environmental uncertainty, creating conditions in which responses became increasingly difficult to stabilize. In this context, repetition became a tool of measurement as researchers tracked how subjects responded when faced with sustained and structured inquiry. The results varied, yet within those variations subtle consistencies began to appear, suggesting that under prolonged exposure the act of questioning itself could influence the coherence of a response, even without direct physical pressure. Some records describe moments where responses seemed to drift rather than break, shifting gradually rather than collapsing, as though the structure of the questioning was guiding the form of the answer without fully determining its content. This gradual drift introduced a new interpretive challenge, as the distinction between an influenced response and a naturally evolving one became increasingly difficult to define. Documentation preserved from these trials points toward a pattern where interrogation shifted away from information retrieval and toward the testing of psychological thresholds, raising questions about whether the act of questioning itself became the primary subject of study. Some references within the records describe attempts to examine how individuals processed uncertainty when confronted with repeated or indirect questioning, where the goal was not simply to obtain answers but to observe how those answers changed under pressure. In this shift, the boundary between observer and participant became less distinct, as the structure of the experiment began to shape the very responses it was meant to measure. The language used in these records often reflects this ambiguity, with descriptions focusing less on outcomes and more on transitions, as though the process itself had become the most significant variable under examination. Even the phrasing of conclusions appears to reflect hesitation, as though the act of recording results required a level of certainty that the observations themselves could no longer support. As experimental conditions intensified, internal correspondence and limited archival references suggest that some participants within the program began to express concern regarding the cumulative effects of prolonged exposure to these techniques, particularly when outcomes no longer aligned with initial expectations. These concerns appear not as direct objections within the primary documentation, but as indications within reports and administrative records that certain results were no longer consistent with earlier observations. The presence of such inconsistencies introduced uncertainty into the work, raising the possibility that the methods being used were producing effects that extended beyond their intended scope. In some instances, results that were once considered repeatable began to diverge without a clear cause, creating gaps in understanding that could not be easily reconciled within the existing framework. Notably, these gaps were not always documented as failures, but sometimes as anomalies that required further observation, allowing uncertainty to persist within the record rather than being resolved. In later stages of the program's activity, procedural adjustments appear to have been introduced in response to inconsistencies in subject behaviour, yet these changes did not resolve the underlying uncertainty that had begun to define the results. Adjustments to questioning techniques and environmental conditions suggest an effort to regain stability within the outcomes, though the variability persisted, reflecting the difficulty of maintaining consistent responses under complex and shifting conditions. Within this environment, the act of refinement did not eliminate uncertainty, but instead revealed how deeply it had become embedded within the structure of the experiments. Each modification introduced new variables, and with them, new points of divergence that further complicated the attempt to establish predictable patterns. The process of adjustment itself began to mirror the very instability it was meant to correct, as each correction introduced its own set of unanticipated effects. The final phase of activity emerged through a gradual reassessment of purpose, where the distinction between controlled study and uncontrolled consequence became increasingly difficult to maintain within the structure of the program. As the work continued, the lack of clear resolution began to weigh against the original objectives, creating a situation where continuation required a level of certainty that could no longer be sustained. The program did not conclude through a singular event, but through a slow reduction in activity where participation diminished and the framework of the study began to dissolve under the weight of its own unresolved findings. Records from this period reflect a transition marked not by conclusion, but by attenuation, as though the system itself was losing coherence from within. The absence of a defined endpoint leaves only the suggestion that the process continued to exist in fragments, even as its formal structure faded from view. And in the absence of complete records, what remains suggests not an ending, but the quiet recognition that something within the process could no longer be reliably measured, even by those who created it. Soldiers at Ground Zero radiation exposure tests, 1940s and 1960s. Measured proximity to nuclear detonation sites during the mid-20th century introduced conditions in which human presence became part of the observational framework itself, and among these controlled exposures, certain programs were later discontinued after researchers declined to continue participation. Within the broader context of nuclear weapons testing conducted by the United States, including operations such as those at the Nevada test site and the Pacific Proving Grounds, The placement of personnel at calculated distances from detonations reflected an effort to understand not only the effects of the blast, but also the thresholds at which observation could still be maintained. The visible detonation, however, represented only a fraction of what was being measured, as much of the data centered on phenomena that could not be directly seen from a distance, including radiation and its interaction with both instruments and living systems. The refusal to continue such experiments did not occur as a single recorded decision, but rather emerged through a gradual reassessment of risk, uncertainty, and the limits of what could be ethically sustained within a controlled framework. Spatial separation from the point of detonation was treated not as a passive safety measure, but as an adjustable variable within a system designed to observe how energy, matter, and human perception responded across measured intervals. Distances were not arbitrary, as positioning determined exposure levels, the timing of shockwave arrival, and the degree to which instruments could remain functional under rapidly changing conditions. In this context, even small adjustments in positioning introduced meaningful differences in what could be recorded and how those recordings would later be interpreted. The structure of these tests relied on a balance between proximity and survivability, where the objective was not to eliminate risk but to observe it under controlled and repeatable circumstances. Yet, as the distances narrowed, the margin between observation and consequence became increasingly difficult to define with precision. In several documented instances, the recorded intervals between exposure and measurement differed slightly from expected values, introducing minor discrepancies that accumulated across datasets and required careful reconciliation. Early data collected from these controlled exposures revealed that the act of observation itself introduced layers of complexity that extended beyond the initial parameters set before each detonation. Instruments designed to measure blast pressure, radiation intensity, and environmental change captured vast amounts of information within fractions of a second, yet the interpretation of that information required far longer periods of analysis. The disparity between collection and understanding created a gap in which preliminary conclusions were often revised or left incomplete. In several cases, recorded measurements indicated levels of radiation that exceeded initial expectations, prompting re-evaluations of both protective measures and experimental design. These early inconsistencies did not halt the work, but instead contributed to a growing awareness that the system of observation was interacting with conditions that were not fully understood. Some archived summaries reference incomplete datasets, where certain fields remain unfilled or partially redacted, suggesting that not all collected information was preserved in a form suitable for later analysis. At the moment of detonation, recorded measurements captured a sequence of rapid environmental changes that unfolded faster than any single observation point could fully document in real time. The release of energy produced immediate and cascading effects, including intense light, heat, and a shockwave that propagated outward through air and ground with measurable force. Instruments positioned at varying distances registered these changes in slightly different sequences, creating a layered record of the event that required careful synchronization to interpret accurately. The detonation itself functioned as both a point of origin and a reference marker, anchoring a complex series of measurements that extended beyond the visible horizon. Despite the precision of these instruments, the sheer speed and scale of the event introduced limitations that could not be fully resolved within the framework of the tests. In certain records, annotations suggest that some measurement channels failed to capture complete sequences, leaving portions of the event reconstructed from partial data rather than continuous observation. Instrument readings taken during and after exposure began to expose a gap between what could be quantified and what could be interpreted within the existing scientific frameworks. While dosimeters and other devices recorded levels of radiation exposure with increasing sensitivity, the translation of those readings into meaningful conclusions required assumptions about how such exposure would manifest over time. In some instances, data appeared consistent within narrow margins, yet broader comparisons revealed variations that could not be easily explained by environmental factors alone. This introduced a subtle but persistent uncertainty into the analysis, as researchers attempted to reconcile precise measurements with outcomes that did not always align with expectations. The instruments themselves remained reliable, but the context in which their readings were understood became increasingly complex. In reviewing these records, later analysts noted that some conclusions were derived from partially incomplete datasets, further contributing to interpretive differences that persisted across separate evaluations. Biological monitoring conducted in the aftermath of exposure documented responses that varied significantly across individuals, even when initial conditions appeared to remain consistent. Medical evaluations conducted over time tracked changes that included shifts in cellular behavior and other indicators associated with radiation exposure, though the full implications of these findings were not immediately clear. The variability observed among subjects suggested that identical conditions did not necessarily produce identical outcomes, complicating efforts to establish consistent patterns. This variability introduced a new layer of difficulty in interpreting results, as it raised questions about the factors that influenced individual responses and how those factors could be accounted for within the experimental design. Over time, these observations contributed to a broader understanding that the effects of exposure extended beyond the immediate moment of detonation. Yet even within these findings, certain observations were recorded without accompanying explanations, leaving portions of the biological record open to interpretation without definitive resolution. Subsequent adjustments to experimental protocols introduced new layers of control intended to stabilize outcomes, yet these modifications often produced further deviations that complicated interpretation. Changes in positioning, timing, and observation methods were implemented in response to earlier inconsistencies, reflecting an effort to refine the process without altering its fundamental structure. However, each adjustment introduced new variables that required separate analysis, creating a cycle in which attempts to improve precision also expanded the scope of uncertainty. The system, rather than becoming more stable, appeared to reveal additional layers of complexity with each modification. This ongoing process of refinement underscored the challenge of maintaining consistency within an environment defined by rapid and high-intensity change. Certain procedural notes suggest that not all adjustments were fully documented in detail, leaving gaps in the record where the rationale for specific changes remains partially obscured. Within internal communications and procedural summaries, subtle indications began to appear that certain aspects of continued participation were becoming increasingly difficult to justify under the established objectives. References to logistical challenges, environmental risks, and evolving safety considerations appeared alongside technical data, suggesting that practical concerns were becoming more prominent in the evaluation of these experiments. These indications were not presented as direct objections, but rather as contextual factors that influence decision-making over time. The cumulative effect of these considerations contributed to a gradual shift in how the program was approached, as the balance between observation and risk required ongoing reassessment. Within this context, the continuation of the work began to require a level of certainty that was no longer consistently supported by the available data. Some internal summaries note discrepancies between projected outcomes and observed results, though the full context of these discrepancies is not consistently preserved across surviving records. As additional data accumulated, inconsistencies in expected outcomes introduced a level of uncertainty that could not be resolved through existing analytical methods alone. Attempts to reconcile these inconsistencies led to further examination of both the experimental conditions and the underlying assumptions guiding interpretation. Despite these efforts, certain patterns remained difficult to explain, and the presence of these unresolved elements began to influence how future tests were structured. The persistence of uncertainty, rather than being eliminated, became an accepted feature of the work, shaping the way in which results were recorded and reviewed. Over time, this acceptance marked a subtle but significant shift in the orientation of the program, as the focus moved from achieving definitive conclusions to managing ongoing ambiguity. Even within structured reports, some entries conclude without resolution, suggesting that not all observations reached a final analytical stage. Operational activity surrounding these exposure-based studies declined gradually as internal assessments shifted toward discontinuation, culminating in a withdrawal that reflected both procedural and human limitations. The reduction in activity did not occur abruptly, but rather followed a pattern of decreasing frequency, as fewer tests were conducted and fewer resources were allocated to their continuation. This gradual decline allowed for the preservation of existing records, though it also marked the end of a process that had once been defined by its intensity and scope. The absence of a formal conclusion leaves only the documentation that remains, which provides insight into the methods and observations, but not always into the decisions that guided their cessation. Within this transition, the program moved from active inquiry to historical record, its purpose defined only by what could still be retrieved from the archives. Yet, within the remaining fragments of those records, the exact point at which observation ended and something else began was never clearly defined. The evidence that forced a reassessment: human radiation exposure programs, 1940s, 1970s. The expansion of nuclear research during the mid-20th century introduced a category of study that extended beyond weapons development and into the biological consequences of radiation exposure, prompting investigations that took place across medical institutions, government-supported facilities, and controlled research environments. Within these settings, exposure was sometimes introduced under carefully defined parameters, where dosage levels, timing intervals, and physical responses were recorded with the intent of understanding how radiation interacted with living systems over extended periods. The focus was not limited to immediate reactions, but extended toward tracking how the body responded across time, particularly in ways that could not be observed within short observation windows. In several documented cases, exposure occurred in environments where the presence of radiation was not always immediately apparent to those being studied, and where follow-up observations became the primary method for tracking outcomes. Researchers monitored changes through repeated examinations, biological sampling, and longitudinal data collection, aiming to map patterns that might reveal thresholds of tolerance or early indicators of long-term effects. These efforts were framed as necessary steps toward establishing a more complete understanding of radiation's impact on the human body, particularly as the technology itself was becoming more widespread and its applications more complex. In this context, the act of observation extended over months or years, with each new data point contributing to a growing but increasingly intricate record. As the data accumulated, certain patterns began to emerge that did not always conform to the expectations set at the beginning of the research. Some effects appeared only after extended delays, while others manifested in ways that were not easily attributable to a single exposure event. In some instances, subjects who initially showed no immediate reaction later exhibited changes that could not be fully explained by the recorded dosage alone, introducing questions about sensitivity, cumulative exposure, and variables that were not fully accounted for at the outset. These inconsistencies were not isolated, and in some cases, they appeared across multiple observations, suggesting that the variability itself might be part of the phenomenon being studied. This created a situation in which the relationship between cause and effect became less direct, requiring researchers to consider factors that extended beyond the initial experimental framework. The presence of these delayed or indirect outcomes introduced a level of uncertainty that could not be resolved simply by repeating trials, as repetition did not always produce consistent or predictable results. Instead, it sometimes reinforced the same inconsistencies, suggesting that the underlying mechanisms were not fully understood. The expectation that additional data would reduce uncertainty gradually gave way to the realization that more data did not necessarily produce clearer conclusions. Within the collected records, there are indications that this growing uncertainty began to influence how the research was interpreted and pursued. In certain cases, additional exposure was no longer pursued with the same consistency, and some lines of inquiry were slowed or set aside as researchers attempted to reconcile the data already gathered. The difficulty was not in collecting more information, but in ensuring that the information being collected could lead to conclusions that were both reliable and complete. In some instances, the process of validation itself became more complex than the original experimentation, requiring additional layers of verification that did not always yield definitive answers. As these challenges accumulated, the structure of the research itself began to shift. Some studies were reduced in scope, while others transitioned into follow-up observation rather than active experimentation. This gradual change did not occur uniformly, but rather across different institutions and timeframes, reflecting a broader reassessment of how such studies could or should continue under the evolving understanding of their implications. The transition was not always explicitly marked in documentation, but instead appeared through changes in frequency, methodology, and the absence of certain types of data that were no longer being actively collected. At the same time, awareness of the conditions under which some of these studies were conducted began to increase, bringing with it questions about consent, disclosure, and the long-term consequences for those involved. These concerns did not always result in immediate action, but they contributed to an environment in which continued research required not only technical justification, but ethical consideration as well. In certain cases, this awareness emerged gradually, as previously isolated accounts and records were later viewed in combination, revealing patterns that had not been fully recognized at the time. This added layer of scrutiny created additional pressure on programs that were already navigating complex scientific uncertainties. In certain instances, this led to the quiet reduction of activity, where research continued in a limited capacity, or was phased out over time rather than brought to an abrupt halt. The decision to continue or withdraw was not always recorded as a single defining moment, but instead appeared as a gradual shift reflected across documents, reports, and institutional changes. What is visible in the record is not a single point of cessation, but a progression toward it, marked by subtle adjustments rather than decisive closure. The archival record from this period preserves both the scale of the effort and the ambiguity that remained within its conclusions. Some findings contributed to a broader understanding of radiation and its biological impact, informing later safety standards and medical approaches, while other aspects of the research remained incomplete, with gaps that could not be fully resolved through the available data. In some cases, the absence of definitive conclusions is itself a part of what remains, highlighting the limits of what could be determined under the conditions in which the research was conducted. In certain cases, the documentation itself suggests that the pursuit of further clarity became increasingly constrained by the limits of what could be observed, measured, or ethically pursued. The act of continuing, once a matter of scientific progression, began to intersect with the realization that some aspects of the subject might not yield to further study without introducing new complications. This realization did not always appear as a single conclusion, but rather as a gradual acknowledgement embedded within the trajectory of the research itself. What remains is a collection of observations that are precise in measurement but less definitive in interpretation, preserved in a way that reflects both the ambition of the research and the boundaries it eventually encountered. And within those records, the unanswered questions remain, not because they were overlooked, but because the conditions required to answer them no longer aligned with the path forward. The methods that could not be sustained. Cold War interrogation research, 1950s, 1960s. During the early and mid-20th century, intelligence agencies in the United States developed a range of classified programs aimed at understanding and improving methods of interrogation, particularly in the context of gathering information from individuals under non-cooperative conditions. These programs emerged alongside broader geopolitical tensions, where access to reliable intelligence became a critical priority, and where traditional questioning techniques were considered insufficient in certain high-stakes environments. Within this context, research into human behavior, perception, and psychological response became a focal point, with studies designed to examine how individuals might react when placed under controlled forms of pressure. In practice, these studies were conducted across a combination of medical facilities, research institutions, and secured government sites, where conditions could be carefully regulated and outcomes observed over time. Subjects were sometimes placed into environments where external stimuli were reduced or altered, allowing researchers to track how changes in surroundings influenced attention, communication, and cognitive stability. The emphasis was not solely on immediate response, but on how individuals adapted or failed to adapt over extended periods of controlled exposure. The operational structure of these programs often relied on layered observation, where multiple researchers monitored different aspects of subject response simultaneously. Behavioral changes were recorded alongside physiological indicators, creating parallel streams of data that could later be compared for consistency. In some cases, observational protocols required repeated assessments at fixed intervals, ensuring that both short-term reactions and longer-term developments were captured within the same framework of study. This approach was intended to reduce gaps in data collection, though it also introduced additional complexity in interpretation. As these experiments progressed, researchers began to refine their methods through repeated application, adjusting variables such as isolation, sensory input, environmental control, and interaction frequency. Each adjustment was intended to isolate specific behavioral responses, with the expectation that patterns would emerge across different trials. However, the results did not always align with these expectations, as responses varied depending on factors that were not always fully identified or understood at the time of testing. This variability introduced a growing challenge within the research, as it became increasingly difficult to determine whether observed outcomes were the result of the methods being applied or the individual characteristics of the subjects themselves. In some cases, identical procedures produced different results when repeated, while in others, similar responses occurred under different conditions. These inconsistencies complicated the effort to establish clear cause and effect relationships, raising questions about the reliability of the methods and the limits of their effectiveness. Further observation revealed that certain effects did not always appear immediately. Instead, they emerged after a delay, sometimes only becoming apparent through follow-up examinations conducted after the initial conditions had ended. This introduced a temporal dimension to the research, where the full impact of a procedure could not be understood within a single time frame. The presence of delayed responses made it more difficult to define the scope of each experiment as outcomes continued to unfold beyond the period of active observation. Over time, the need for extended monitoring became increasingly apparent. Some cases required repeated observation across weeks or months, as early conclusions proved insufficient to capture the full range of responses. This extended timeline placed additional demands on both the researchers and the structure of the programs, requiring sustained coordination and continuity in documentation. The accumulation of longitudinal data added depth to the research, but also reinforced the difficulty of isolating clear and consistent interpretations from the results. Within internal documentation, there are indications that these findings prompted reassessment among those conducting the research. While some results were considered useful in advancing understanding of human response under controlled conditions, others raised concerns about the consistency and interpretability of the data. The challenge was no longer limited to producing measurable outcomes, but extended to determining whether those outcomes could be meaningfully applied in broader contexts. As the scope of the research continued, attention increasingly turned toward the long-term implications of the methods being used. Observations suggested that some effects persisted beyond the immediate duration of exposure, raising questions about duration, recovery, and the potential for lasting impact. These considerations added another layer of complexity as researchers attempted to balance the pursuit of knowledge with an emerging awareness of consequences that extended beyond the controlled environment. At the same time, the structure of the research began to shift in response to these challenges. Certain procedures were reduced or modified, while others transitioned from active experimentation to observational study. This gradual change did not occur uniformly, but reflected differences in how individual programs and institutions responded to the accumulating data and the questions it raised. The documentation from this period shows a movement away from direct application toward more cautious and limited forms of inquiry. In some instances, the reduction of activity is reflected not in explicit statements, but in the absence of further entries within specific lines of study. Gaps appear in the record where earlier documentation had been consistent, suggesting that certain methods were no longer being pursued with the same frequency or priority. This shift is subtle in form, but significant in implication, as it indicates a transition that unfolded gradually rather than through formal cessation. Within this evolving framework, the continuation of certain methods became increasingly difficult to sustain. The conditions required to maintain consistent results were not always available, and the outcomes being produced no longer aligned as clearly with the expectations that had guided earlier phases of the research. In some cases, this led to the gradual discontinuation of specific approaches, not as a singular decision, but as part of an ongoing reassessment of what could reasonably be continued. In the surviving archival record, the collected findings reflect both the ambition that drove the research forward and the limitations that eventually constrained its direction. The data offers insight into how individuals respond under controlled conditions, yet it also reveals how those responses become increasingly difficult to interpret when the variables involved cannot be fully contained or understood. Across the documentation, there is a consistent sense of progress paired with uncertainty, where each conclusion appears to introduce new questions rather than resolve existing ones. And it was at that boundary that the research ultimately came to a halt, leaving behind questions that no longer had the conditions required to be answered. The trial that became impossible to continue, Guatemala Syphilis Experiments, 1946-1948. In the years immediately following the Second World War, medical studies conducted under United States direction in Guatemala unfolded within a framework shaped by both scientific ambition and institutional coordination. Within this framework, procedures were implemented under the oversight of the United States Public Health Service, with involvement from researchers such as John C. Cutler. At multiple locations across Guatemala, clinical activity was organized in a way that allowed observation and intervention to occur within the same operational setting. Medical facilities, along with associated field sites, were used to carry out procedures that aligned with the study's objectives, while also maintaining the outward appearance of standard clinical practice. This dual structure allowed the study to proceed without disrupting the broader medical environments in which it operated, preserving continuity while integrating additional procedures into existing systems. The structure of these procedures placed participants in conditions where exposure could be introduced without the same safeguards typically associated with medical treatment. Individuals involved in the study were drawn from different groups, and their participation occurred within systems that did not consistently apply modern standards of informed consent. The absence of uniform disclosure meant that the nature of certain procedures was not always fully understood by those affected, creating a separation between the intent of the study and the awareness of its participants. In certain phases of the study, infectious agents were introduced deliberately as part of controlled efforts to observe transmission and progression. These interventions were not uniform across all participants, as different conditions and methods were applied depending on the objectives of each phase. The controlled introduction of infection allowed researchers to observe how the disease developed under specific circumstances, but it also introduced outcomes that extended beyond observation alone, as exposure itself became an active variable within the study. These interventions altered the expected course of infection, creating outcomes that required continued monitoring under evolving conditions. The progression of symptoms, responses to treatment, and variations in individual outcomes became central elements of observation, as researchers attempted to document how different factors influenced the course of disease. The complexity of these outcomes reflected the interaction between controlled procedures and the biological variability of the individuals involved, making each case distinct while still contributing to the broader body of data. As the study progressed, the line between standard clinical practice and experimental procedure became increasingly difficult to distinguish. Procedures that might have been interpreted as treatment in one context were, in this setting, part of a structured effort to observe and influence disease behavior. This overlap introduced a level of ambiguity into the study, where the distinction between care and experimentation was not always clearly defined within the operational framework. Institutional coordination allowed these activities to continue across multiple sites, forming a network of overlapping procedures and observations. The involvement of governmental agencies and local institutions created a structure through which the study could be implemented across different environments, each contributing to the overall scope of the project. This coordination ensured that procedures could be carried out in a consistent manner, even as they were applied in varied contexts with differing local conditions. The interaction between researchers and participants occurred within systems where consent was not consistently applied in a manner aligned with modern ethical standards. Decisions regarding participation and exposure were shaped by the institutional context of the time, which did not always require the same level of disclosure or voluntary agreement that would later become standard in medical research. This created conditions in which the relationship between researcher and participant was defined more by procedural implementation than by mutual understanding. Documentation from the period reflects a gradual expansion of procedures that extended beyond the original scope of the study. As new observations were made, additional methods were introduced to explore related questions, resulting in a layered structure of experimentation that developed over time. This expansion was not necessarily linear, as adjustments were made in response to emerging findings, leading to changes in how the study was conducted across different phases. The results that emerged from these procedures revealed inconsistencies that could not be fully reconciled within the study's initial framework. Variations in outcomes, differences in individual responses, and the influence of external factors all contributed to a body of data that resisted simple categorization. These inconsistencies highlighted the limitations of the study's design, particularly in its ability to account for all variables that affected the observed outcomes. The conditions under which the study was conducted also introduced limitations related to record keeping and long-term analysis. While documentation was maintained throughout the study, not all aspects of the procedures were captured in a way that allows for complete reconstruction. This has contributed to ongoing efforts to understand the full scope of the study, as researchers and historians examine the available materials to piece together a more comprehensive account of what occurred. The structure of the study, combined with the conditions in which it was carried out, reflects a period in which medical research operated within different ethical and